This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. If that didn't wake you up, I don't know what would, because today we're talking about breaking, also known as breakdancing, made its debut at this year's Summer Olympics in Paris.
Look at him. Here he goes.
This is hip-hop at its finest.
The buzz around breaking might seem new, but the art form has been around for decades. Breaking began on the streets of the Bronx in the 1970s alongside the rise of hip-hop. Since then, it's steadily grown in popularity. It was even featured in classic movies like Flashdance and Beat Street. Today, you can catch breakers, also called b-boys and b-girls, battling it out across the country and the globe. Whether they're spinning on their heads or freezing in gravity-defying poses. This hour, we'll be looking at the evolution of breaking from city streets to the Olympic stage. We have with us Professor Rosemary Roberts, who's a dance studies scholar, dancer, educator, and social psychologist. She teaches at Connecticut College, and she's also the author of Bearing Unbearable Sensualities. Professor Roberts, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm so thrilled to be here. And my heart is warm by the way you started. The music is kicking.
You know, we might be getting a little sweaty already, but hey, that's how we're going to start this day. And also with us, who is smiling, is Brandon Kalut. He's a choreographer and b-boy known as B-Boy Electronic, or New England's freshest b-boy. He's also with us in studio today. Thank you so much, B, for being on the show with us.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for having. Very, very pumped. And yeah, I almost started busting a move out here.
I know. I almost kind of wish you did.
Yeah, I don't want to mess up your guys' set. It's real nice in here. So thank you for having.
We appreciate your thoughtfulness. Very demure, very demure of you. And for our listeners, if we have any breakers out there, let us know. Share your story with us or send us some videos or pictures of you breaking. 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Professor Roberts, I want to start with you, sort of kind of bring us back to the basics a little bit. Can you tell us what is breaking?
So breaking is one of the foundational styles of hip hop. And, hip hop, and I'm going to put a slash mark, street dance. Street dance is really defines all of what we're going to be talking about today, but also what people know as hip hop. And in the 70s, it was performed to, to soul, to funk, to rock, to disco records. It's fast paced dance movements with a pause or several pauses. And it features in it breaks in a song. So particularly the drum and the drum bass and the sections of a song. And, DJs kind of, sometimes they use two records or two of the same record to kind of extend that breaking section, because that's really what dancers were responding to that particular aspect of the music, that particular section of the music. So not so much the lyrics or the melody, but the breaks. So that's sort of how it gets its name, because it's where the breaks happen, that the movement is, breaking it down, so to speak. And it has these, kind of discernible components, top rock, footwork, go down is what some breakers call it, spins, air moves or power moves, and freezes. And then, sort of the essential elements of breaking are really its history, community, and its aesthetics. So.
And there's so much history. Yeah, there's so much history here. And that's why I kind of want to start out with the basics, because, there's so much nuance here too. And is it correct to call it breaking rather than breakdancing?
Yeah. So, as it moves into the commercial world, it becomes breakdancing in movies and so forth. But and please, B-Boy Electronic, please jump in here, because it's as far as is I can tell in terms of the breakers and the street dancers that I've interviewed and talked to, breaking is the term with sort of within the community of street dancers and breakers.
Absolutely, yeah. The OGs, we call them the OGs, the purists. They'll always say, it's breaking. But to be frank, breakdancing I think is a fine term. Actually, I think it's even more descriptive of what's happening.
Sure.
So for me, it's cool.
All right.
Breakdancing, b-boying, b-girling, all the same.
Well, I can see the differentiation needed if you're not talking about if you're not talking about dancing, you're saying you're breaking, it could mean something very different.
Absolutely, right.
And so, can you talk about, what do breakers look for when choosing music? Is it easier? Are there certain music that's easier to break than others? Do you usually go for classics? I'm assuming the music evolves as well. What do you do when you're choosing music?
Yeah, so kind of like what Professor said there is the drum, that drum loop really is what started this whole thing off, so the breakdown or the break for the DJs was always about finding that nice drum loop. And I guess, as a b-boy, I'm looking for the same thing, except now with digital media, it's so much easier to mix things. And, I joke that there's really like maybe 20 or 30 songs.
Sure.
But just, hip hop is so big on remix culture. It just, people experiment with the same loop 10 different ways, So you're looking for that energy, that power in the drum for sure.
And Professor Roberts, talk to us about the origins of breaking. We were talking about history earlier, where this is actually a genre, if you will, with so much nuance. Where did this form of dance begin, and who were some of the pioneers?
So, my voice is all of a sudden a little crackly here. So, there are a bunch of origin stories. One of the most popular ones takes us back to the Bronx. And people often say it's the South Bronx. Yes, the South Bronx. But there's also the West Bronx. Cool Herc, Clive, who became popularly known as DJ Kool Herc. So immigrates from Jamaica, has an amazing sound system, and his sister, and this is a piece of the history that often is not told, but his sister, Cindy Campbell, wants to raise money for back to school clothes. Fordham Road in the Bronx is where people go shopping, but she's like, you know what? I don't want to go to Fordham Road. I want to go to Delancey Street in Manhattan, Lower Manhattan. So she wants to raise money. It's like, cool, I'm going to throw a party. So she throws this party in the community center within the building that they live in the West Bronx. And, she gets her brother to DJ. And sort of that becomes sort of the place where, they're like, they do index cards as posters. And, now they're doing tours in the Bronx, by the way, at this celebration of the 50th anniversary of the building where this occurred. And people are like, this is where it was born?
Wow.
Because it's literally a community center within a large building. And the space is actually not that big. So earlier when you were like, when B-Boy was saying, how I could bust a move, I could imagine busting a move in a very kind of confined place, because that's sort of how, all of these moves get innovated, is using what you have available to you in terms of space, in terms of floor, in terms of music, in terms of sound. So that is one of sort of the origin stories of hip hop, street dance, and breaking specifically. And cool DJ Herc, starts to kind of experiment with these different elements of music from Jamaica, dance hall music, and this booming sound. But he's very, he wants to connect with the dancers. And the way he does that is he watches very carefully and what's happening, what's the music that people are vibing to, what that are moving to, and then that extended, and then starts to kind of figure out we need to extend the breaks because that's when it's lit on the dance floor. On the dance floor, in community centers, on the streets, block parties, but also when it starts to migrate into clubs.
Well, I love that story so much because it's blending sort of nothing brings more people in to support a cause like back to school than a fun neighborhood party. And the fact that it started in a community center, it kind of makes sense to me because B, tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think breaking at its core was about bringing people together in community and having a good time.
Absolutely. I mean, I like to quote the original slogan, peace, love, unity, and having fun.
Mm.
And I love that that having fun bit is on there because I almost imagine like, the four creators of hip hop being like, yes, peace, yes, love, yes, unity, yes. And someone's like, hey, what about the fun stuff?
Right.
It's like, yeah, so having fun has always been such an important part, especially going back to 70s Bronx, if you weren't at the Cool Herc party, chances are you were probably doing something you weren't supposed to be doing as a young person. So these parties provided things to do, constructive things to do for young folks.
And do you think that message is equally as important today to have especially the having fun part?
Absolutely. And having fun and I think also finding your craft, and having fun within that, absolutely.
Yeah, we're too stressed as it is. So if you can have fun in your craft, I think that's a very good place to be. And Professor Roberts, as you sort of share with us sort of the building grounds of the foundations of how breaking started, can you also talk about what were some of the socio and political conditions that breaking was born out of?
Yeah, so breaking, comes, as Brandon was saying, sort of it comes into its birth in this environment where, in the Bronx, South Bronx particularly, where there was an extraction. It was like extraction of labor, and financially, the city was just really moving all of its funds out of the South Bronx. So you have, buildings burning, sort of the things that we see. And I'm not saying this to romanticize it by any stretch of the imagination, but it was a reality of what was happening in the South Bronx. Landlords were paying folks who lived in the community to burn buildings so that they can collect the insurance.
Right.
So these were sort of the conditions that breaking and street dance was born in. I'm originally from the South Bronx, so I remember vividly how the face of buildings were being covered, the windows specifically, with these huge placards that had a flower box, and it had a shade. And so if you were driving by the South Bronx and the Sheridan Parkway in particular, moving, kind of away from the Bronx, but through the Bronx, that's what you saw on the face of the building. But on the other side, if you lived in the community, what you were experiencing and what you were living in was rubble, was, no heat, no hot water, and so forth. So this is sort of and people within the community were kind of coming together to kind of take care of each other, which is why community is such an important aspect of breaking. And fun, to celebrate, to be together, to have a place where you could, as Brandon said, practice your craft, because people often talk about dance, hip hop, or street dance as a technique. It's much more than that. It's a dance practice, and it's through this creative creative practice that so much of what we know has been now codified into these different components that I spoke of come to be. For my book, I interviewed Stefan Clemente, Mr. Wiggles, and he's also from the South Bronx, and he talks about, he's like one of the OGs of hip hop and street dance, and he talks about how the young people were talking about, how do we bring visibility to the conditions, the social conditions, the economic conditions that we're living in. And so, all right, so if we're breaking on the streets and we make this a spectacle, we'll bring the cameras in. The cameras will document the movements, but they'll also document the conditions that we're living in. And so you can't break apart. You can't separate the social economic conditions of a people and then what they produce within community to take care of one of themselves. It's a creative process as well, and to kind of keep that community alive and happening.
Well, I think it's amazing to sort of follow and trace the dance steps of history with breaking, because you mentioned so many elements just within this short time frame. You've got education, you got community, you got having fun. Would you say breaking was also and is also a form of resistance in terms of, they wanted these movements to bring eyes to show the conditions, and I imagine it's also resisting what's happening to them.
Yeah, and so, but if you locate street dance breaking specifically within a broader context of Afro-diasporic dance, for example, there's a long history of knowing and seeing dance as a form of knowledge production, as a reflection of people's lives and their lived experience, as storytelling, which is a very important part of breaking, and of pushing back on, even by retaining the history of say, of colonization, or the history of any of the systems, any of the kind of inequities that we live in, historically and contemporarily, bringing those into the body, through the body, and then producing knowledge about what is actually happening. What does it mean to move in a particular way? What is the story that we want to tell? And dance as resistance also, it's one of the things that I teach about.
Right.
I used to teach a course called Embodied Resistance, and this is what we're talking about. To be able to remember, to bring an untold or obscured history together and tell it through the body, which is the way that, if you're not going to write it down, or other people are going to minimize it, this is how we are going to push back, by telling our stories.
Well, that's such a great transition for a question I have for B, actually, is we've been talking about this. It started as a little bit of a niche-y type of movement straight from the Bronx, but it definitely became a lot bigger than maybe many people have imagined. And we're going to talk more about breaking becoming a part of the Olympics a little bit later on in the show. But I want to start by talking about how it's actually been on the global stage for a very long time, and with breakers all around the world breaking in community. So what goes through your mind when you realize, and you're like, wow, like people all over the world are doing this?
Yeah, I think it's such a beautiful thing, how many things can we point at in the world where, every country, every type of person, doesn't matter what the background, there's breakers, and what's really cool too is, each region kind of specializing in their own, techniques, even within breaking, for example, I know like out in Europe, there's a lot of what we call power heads, they're doing the head spins and the windmills and things like that. And, you mentioned the Olympics, and out in Australia, they're a little more, I think, storytelling driven. So it's just cool to see that there's all these different representations, and it fills my heart with joy, honestly. Honestly, it makes me feel that, as corny as this may sound, hip hop, I think is saving the world, to be honest, just because it's undeniable, breaking in particular.
Were you surprised as a b-boy yourself to see what a phenomenon it's been?
I mean, when I came into the scene, I feel like, there was already a whole bunch of momentum, but even just seeing how the culture has grown from when I started breaking, maybe, I don't know, 20 or so years ago. It's beautiful. You got these competitions, Red Bull. I'm thinking of Battle of the Year. So it's definitely it's cool to see how it's expanded.
Well, we're going to be digging deeper into the world of breaking after a quick break. You've been listening to Brandon Kalut, aka B-Boy Electronic, and also Professor Rosemary Roberts, who will be back to talk to us about the origins of breaking. And coming up next, we're also going to be talking about how did this form of dance move from the streets to the stage. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
Bodies all over the street, but now it's hip hop, breakdancing, pop, electric boogie just won't stop. Everything in the town is built around that cutting, scratching, and hip hop.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're looking at the evolution of breaking, also known as breakdancing. I'm joined by Professor Rosemary Roberts from Connecticut College. Professor Roberts is a dance studies scholar, dancer, educator, and a social psychologist, and she's also the author of Bearing Unbearable Sensualities. And I'm also joined by Brandon Kalut, who's a choreographer and b-boy known as B-Boy Electronic. And for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions about breaking, or if you're a breaker yourself. We would love to hear from you, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Professor Roberts, can you tell me more about your personal journey with breaking and other forms of dance? When did you know that you were a dancer and this was where you wanted to pursue?
Oh boy. So
you got
well,
this.
I started dancing at a very early age. I learned not just about 3 or 4 years ago that it was actually my aunt who paid for my dance lessons. Because I always danced. I remember my dad used to play music on the big console stereo, and I would be dancing. I evidently had a name that I called myself. And when I would go out with my aunt and we'd be walking the streets of the Bronx and there's music, what would happen? We'd need to stop because I'd need to dance. I learned to dance on my dad's feet, dance salsa. My dad was originally from Puerto Rico. And so there's that aspect. So I start taking lessons, but I don't have the body. I start going to an actual studio, the Acaro Sisters studio on Bruckner Boulevard. It no longer exists. Because I'm old, but that's why it's to start taking formal dance lessons in ballet, in tap, etc. But I don't have the body for a dancer. Aesthetically, I'm not tall, I'm not thin, I have hips, and so I start to feel very self-conscious, and so I basically kind of stop. Taking formal dance training.
Right.
Pan, many years later, I'm working on a one-woman show about my life with someone, and she asks me, "So, what do you know about the dances and that are sort of indigenous to you, being a, parents from Puerto Rico, from Cuba, Jamaica, like, what do you know? And I realized that I knew very little, if anything. And so I start to study what at the time downtown in Manhattan, I start to study Afro-Caribbean dance with one of my teachers, Richard Gonzalez. And I never do the one-woman show, but I started to, do like Afro-Cuban dance and Brazilian and Haitian and Puerto Rican, all traditional dances, bombi plena. And my body sort of, it just gives me a sense of life and invigoration, but I then want to know more. I want to study more. I want to know, what are the origins? I have to learn the music. I have to learn like all the aspects of it, the history of it. And then, so I start to do that. I go to, I'm in college, but then I go and I get my PhD in social psychology. And while I'm doing that, I realize through the work of Catherine Dunham, which is one of our mothers of dance, I start to learn how, dance is a way that people move. It's a way of life for people. It has all of these really interesting influences. Haitian dance. It has influences from West Africa. And so being someone who loves to sweat physically and intellectually, I just love all of this. And I just go into this sort of study of the context as well as the practice. I'm in a PhD program. And when you're in a PhD program, we lose our bodies. It's all about the intellect. And so I start to kind of figure out, how do I bring these together? How do I bring the intellect and the body together? And so that becomes my way in. In 2009, there was something called the Hip Hop Continuum at Jacob's Pillow, which is up in the Berkshires, run by Rennie Harris and all of these OGs of hip hop. And I'm starting to study this project that I call Locating the Body in hip hop. And so I spend some time, which is what the book is based on, with all of these amazing educators to try to figure out, kind of what's happening in the studios, what do young people understand about street dance from all these different backgrounds, where are they getting their information from, and what is the power, if any, of teaching movement as it relates to the context from which it derives in its community settings.
Well, it's been really fun. It's been really fun hearing you sort of dance your way into this rabbit hole, and clearly it's still going. And I love that we're having this conversation because, like we were saying earlier, it's just there's so much here that I never thought there's so much history to this. And of course, B, I want to sort of pose a very similar question to you: is how did you first get involved in breaking? Was there that moment?
I feel like as a youngster, I was always a pretty like active and athletic kid. I was that weird kid at recess, trying to get on top of the monkey bars.
Oh, I was like that too, yeah. Because of the lava.
There you go. So I was just always bouncing around and flipping around. So I got into it just kind of from watching folks on TV. I remember I used to watch this dancer shadow. His name is B-Boy Do-Knock, John Cruz. And there was just a show back in the day, going back here, Star Search. Oh man, I just remember I was like, I'm learning all those flips. I was like, every flip I see Do-Knock do, I'm going to learn. And just some other breakers, Ryan Confederato, some other folks that really inspired me, like real young. I'm talking like maybe 8, 9, 10, And then after really just trying to emulate from what I saw, I was grateful enough to discover the greater scene out here in Connecticut. And that's when things really popped off, when I linked up with my hometown's in New Britain. So I linked up with some of the B-boys out there, and we used to practice at we call this the band shell out in Walnut Hill Park. And we used to be practicing out there, man, like hours, just having fun, exchanging. The OGs would, give me tips and things like that. So that's kind of how I got into it.
Do you remember some of the first moves that you were able to do and you're like, I did that?
Oh yeah. I mean, when you first learn your first like power move, and power moves are all the like the hip centric moves, the moves that require your hip rotation. The windmills, head spins, flares. Yeah, I'll never forget learning my first flare because I was working on it for like it felt like month, like 7, 8 months.
How would you describe a flare?
Um, how would I describe a flare? So if you've seen like gymnastics, you've probably seen the move, but it's like your legs are in a V position and you're swinging your hips
Okay,
around.
got it.
A lot of times the gymnast will do it on a pommel horse, you know. So once you unlock some of these moves, it's like, how the heck did I get my body to do that? But then of course you go, oh, I've been in my living room for the last 7, 8 months working on this, so it pays off.
And the Professor Roberts with B just kind of sharing his OG story. Can you also talk about who were some of the first people to bring breaking from the community and the streets onto the stage?
On the stage itself, can I say something though?
Yeah,
Because I
go for
want
it.
to something that couple of things that jump out at me. That Brandon can narrate his teachers. That's a very important part of this dance practice, right? That you say like, this is who I come from. This is my lineage.
Absolutely.
That's super important among dance practitioners. Sort of the way that you say, I got this is who I'm repping.
Right.
This is the community I'm repping. That's a really important part of it. And just all the way that it when he was talking about the flares and, how he's talked about gymnastics, the way that street dance breaking has borrowed from all kinds of movements and dances. I mean, kung fu movies were very important in the early iterations of breaking. So you see that. How are the elders walking? Oh, they're walking this certain kind of way. Well, then that's how I'm gonna bring that into my my breaking moves. But you asked me a question. I want to come back to it. So could you repeat the question for
Absolutely.
me?
It's who are some of the first people to bring breaking from the community and onto the stage?
So, there's this moment that we talk about with Rennie Harris, Pure Movement, who is from Philly. And he is sort of known for the first to kind of bring street dance, hip hop dance onto the concert stage. And that now it's being performed in this sort of on the proscenium stage, so to speak. So he's really, really known for that. You also have a bunch of groups, Fabulous Five, much earlier than Rennie Harris, that are, crews. They start as crews on the streets, but then they they clean it up to be more performative, and then they're bringing they're bringing shows to the community, but also outside of the community, performing different kinds of different styles of street dance.
And B, you've been, I think, in both worlds, dancing on the streets and parks, and also dancing on the stage. And speaking of really bringing this to a different audience, you've played a role in bringing breaking to the stage locally. And so I want to ask you about breakdancing Shakespeare.
Yeah,
Tell
yes,
us about
indeed.
that.
Yeah, so I mean, breakdancing
wait to
Shakespeare. Yeah, it's a really cool program that I've been just so excited to be a part of for years now. Going back to kind of how I first started. So I mentioned that I was always just kind of bouncing around as a youngster. But in 08, 09 is when, in addition to linking up with some of my mentors, that's also when I discovered the Hartford stage. And I got wind that they were doing a program, and predates my involvement there. They were doing a program since '06 called Breakdancing Shakespeare, and the apprentices would get paid, for your involvement. So I'm thinking, wow, like as a high schooler, I
Right.
could audition, and this is like a summer gig. I'm like, yeah, this is lit. Of course I'm going for this. So yeah, it's a 6-week long summer program that Harvard Stage produces, and we like it says, we combine breaking and Shakespeare, and we do a different Shakespeare play every year. So this last summer we actually did Love's Labor's Lost.
Wow.
So it's always a fun time bringing those two worlds together.
Well, and because you mentioned storytelling earlier, and we've also talked about Shakespeare is sort of, master storyteller. So many different ways to bring in his storytelling. Never thought breakdancing was going to be a part of it, which is blows my mind in the best way possible. Are there things that the body can say that words can't? Can movement say even more sometimes? Especially, just using Shakespeare as an example. It was written for the people, but language has changed. Oftentimes it doesn't translate well in terms of, I don't get it because it's not written the way that I speak today, but maybe through dance.
Absolutely, and that is the whole premise. I got to give a big shout out to my director over there, Nina Pynchon. She's the one who I'm thinking of her in this moment because she's the one who actually cuts our script. So we do all the words as Shakespeare had it, but we don't usually do the whole play, or else
Sure.
we'd be there for 3.5 hours.
Which I don't mind.
Yeah, the BDS extended,
Right.
but we've done even like a 90-minute show, and it's exactly it. So Nina goes through and says, okay, these words could still work as text, but Brandon, for this part of the story, you got to figure out how to have the Romeo versus Tybalt fight, or for example, or so absolutely we use breaking as, actually, for breakdancing Shakespeare, the whole original premise was to replace the violence, which goes back to kind of how hip hop and breaking even started in the first place. But with Shakespeare was to replace the violence in Romeo and Juliet with dance. That would it's just that wherever there's supposed to be a fight,
Right.
we're going to dance instead. And then it kind of just grew from there.
A dance off, I think.
Literally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, now I really, really need to see this, and we're going to be talking more about breaking in the global stage in our next segment. And this hour, we're exploring the past and present of breaking, also known as breakdancing. And coming up next, we'll talk about its debut at the Summer Olympics. And let us know, listeners, if you caught any of the breaking events that aired. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
Yeah. Peace, my brother.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Breaking, also called breakdancing, is a popular form of dance that began in the Bronx half a century ago. Since then, it's blown up and even making its way to this summer's Olympic Games in Paris. So I want to jump straight to you, B. Earlier, we talked a lot about how breaking started as an outlet from the sort of socio-economic struggles of Black and brown youth in the Bronx. Was there a concern about losing that foundation when it transitioned to a global stage at the Olympics?
Absolutely. Definitely talks in the community, about, is how they're going to do the judging, how the music. That's one thing I was particularly concerned about was how are they going to do the music. There definitely were concerns, but, at least personally, I feel like they did a pretty good job representing. Yeah.
Okay, so there are no surprises for you, I guess, from where you were standing from?
No, it looked pretty like a, traditional, not traditional, but like a good old, hip hop jam to me, like a classic battle. So
Great.
I think they
No,
did a
that's
good
good.
job.
And Professor Roberts also sort of with that, because we mentioned earlier too, talking about the differentiation between calling it breaking versus breakdancing. There's sort of the commercialization of it. Was there, or is there, do you think, is there something lost when breaking starts to get scored and judged? Or does it actually add to the excitement?
I think that, what's the goal of it, right? If is the goal of it like so for example, let me use battling as a way to talk about this.
Sure.
The sort of the origins of battling are, you're gonna burn somebody, you're gonna use your best moves to 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 be better than your component, or your opponent. But there's this sort of, it's very connected, right? It's connected to the larger kind of the cipher. It's happening within this sort of energy circle that people are contributing to and hyping or not hyping. The community sort of becomes the judge. So what happens when that goes into a different kind of space where what's at stake is different. What's at stake is money. What's at stake is sort of where the individual is standing out. And it's not to say that the individual does not stand out as breaking. I mean, you develop your individual style, but you develop it based on what you've learned and what you're kind of drawing on in community. So yeah, I wonder, and then the judge becomes someone who obviously is an expert, or a set of judges are experts. But what gets lost when it's the community that's not judging it, and then you're trying to, and this is I'm wondering about this, the extent to which your rubric to judge, like what are going to be the parameters of judging, are really based on athletics. And thinking about movement as athletic. And is it athletics? Yes, but it's much more than that. There's that aesthetic component, there's that foundations component, there's that community component. So how do those aspects, really important aspects of breaking, get broken down or disappear in that kind of forum? On the other hand, it's now on a worldwide stage, but it doesn't mean that hasn't been the case for many, 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 many years. People are writing histories now that say, yeah, the Bronx is where it was happening, but contemporaneously it was happening on the West Coast, and this is what was being developed on the West Coast. This was being developed in the Midwest in Chicago. This is what was being developed in Europe. This is what was being developed in Africa. So those are the questions that that come up for me when I'm thinking about how hip hop, how street dance, how breaking moves outside of its origins and then gets spread to different places. What is gained and then what's also lost.
Well, and building on what Professor Robert just said, one breaker really dominated the headlines during the Olympics. And you mentioned Australia earlier, Australian breaker Rachel Gunn, a.k.a. Ray Gunn. What are your thoughts on some of the backlash that she received? I was a little bit shocked at how intense it's been.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's a couple things happening. If you try and look at her battle as a whole, she did well. But of course, we're in the clip era. So she definitely had some hysterical moments, I would say. Sure. If you're just looking at those out of context from what we call, your larger set.
Sure.
So I feel like that was unfortunate. And but the reality is, Ray Gunn was just I'd say she was exercising a section of breaking, the conceptualizing, the storytelling. I think she was getting into that bag more than the I'm going to spin on my head and then freeze on a dime. And, so, yeah, it's unfortunate that she got that backlash, but I'm happy that breaking has this kind of spotlight on it, for people to hopefully learn and educate themselves more.
Well, and with that too, actually, I think what my exposure to breaking, one of the things that jumped out to me was, I mean, it's literally breaking barriers in so many different ways. And one thing that jumped out to me also was age, because
Mhm.
I've seen, just from my exposure, I've seen breakers from 8 years old to 65 years old.
Yeah,
Is there an age limit for this?
to everybody.
Mm.
And I mean, we joke that it's a young person's sport. We say that, but it really is for everybody. I used to break with this dude out in Middletown.
Hmm.
So we call him old school.
Hmm.
B-boy old school. This dude was fresh. You know what I'm saying? And like maybe he wasn't as swift or as quick,
Hmm.
but he was still showing up and representing. And I think that that's really the most important thing is, are you showing up to just represent yourself and who you are?
Right. And Professor Roberts, any thoughts on that too? Breaking different kinds of barriers?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is for everyone. I see breakers, OGs. Their movements sometimes, get really kind of more contained, smaller, maybe not, but deeper, as over the years. Whereas a young person would, kind of have that exert their energy in a different kind of way
Mm.
that maybe isn't as contained, but it's bigger. So yeah. And I also want to just sort of underscore what happens. These movements were not always called what they're called now, right?
Sure.
They
Right.
weren't always called, top rock and freeze and so forth. As movement becomes codified, then we start to look at the particular ways that what we've given that label to is then gets defined, which is also how we can judge it, right? We can say, oh yeah, this is a good version of a freeze, or of a spin or a power move. Um, so that's great. But then also what gets lost in that. Yeah.
Well, and we've got about 45 seconds here. We'd love some final thoughts from B here. What I'm getting out from this conversation is I need to start stretching
Yeah.
and do some moves. But any final thoughts for our listeners? What do you hope they come out from this today?
I'll say just to, continue to just educate yourself on hip hop and even if you're not a practicer or a practitioner of a style, hip hop is so and breaking is so around us. I think it'll behoove you to just get familiar with great programming like this here.
Well, thank you to B-Boy Electronic for sharing your story with us today and helping us start some moves. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having.
And also with Professor Rosemary Roberts, who's a scholar and dancer and educator and also author of Bearing Unbearable Sensualities. Professor Roberts, thank you for sharing your story with us as well.
Thank you.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Chloe Nguyen. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you so much for listening and happy breaking, everyone.